Hey, Storymakers. We are so excited. Today we have Sarah. She is a Bible expert, and we are going to get into the Old Testament today and get the party started in Genesis.
Woo.
We started our first adventure, obviously, with creation, and we cannot wait to really dig in because these stories aren't just for kids, but they're for the grown-ups too. One of the things that we love about exploring Bible stories is that they get to come back to us as grown-ups, and we get to reimagine and revisit them and think about what we keep and leave behind from our past. And Sarah's going to help us navigate that along. So, hey, Sarah, welcome to Storymakerland.
Hey. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah.
It was so fun.
Well, for those of you who don't know Sarah, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I am a teacher of the Old Testament. So that's what I get to do day in and day out. I finished my 18th year of teaching. I'm about to start my 19th year. And
Woo.
I teach Old Testament to the juniors at Orange Lutheran High School in Orange, California. And Genesis 1-3 is my jam. So I'm so excited to be here and to talk about it.
Well, I'm so excited to dig into. Guys, today we're going to be talking about Genesis 1-3, and I just want to give you a little bit of scope of what we're going to be getting into. We're going to be talking about why is God good? How do we know that in the first 3 chapters? How do the first 3 chapters set us up for redemptive narrative? And what does this have to do with our image-bearing nature? So, Sarah, I would love for you maybe just to give us a snapshot of who do people think authored Genesis, and how do we know God is good in those first 3 chapters?
Yeah. There's so much to unpack. So one of the things I think is so important before we even touch Genesis 1-3 is remembering the context that it's written in, and what the world around believed at the time that the authors, not just Moses is typically who we talk about because he's the one that kind of is first tasked with writing it down, but God's people are always looking at and touching Genesis as we're kind of seeing the story of God's people unfold. And yet kind of the thing that unites all of those people is that the worldview they had is so different than our worldview. And a few things with it, just what they thought about the universe and how the universe looks and kind of what your place as a human is in the universe. I could talk all day about that. I do that a lot with my students. But then on top of it, what did the rest of, we call it the ancient Near East world. So sorry, it's just you just got to sound nerdy from the get-go. But the ancient Near East world,
everything.
Yeah. So when I say that, I mean, what did Assyria believe? What did Babylon believe? What did Egypt believe? Samaria, Canaanites, all the ites. What did they believe about their God and their place in it? And probably some of the parents have kids that are in their Greek mythology era.
Oh, yeah.
And so you kind of can if you know anything about the Greek mythology, you're kind of in the right space of there's Zeus and he's king of the gods, but every story my son is in is this god's trying to steal power from this god. Or Disney always likes to clean it up. My kid is reading one comic book series about all the gods, and I was like, oh, they're telling the real stories because they're not sanitizing it. And the way that the gods interact with humans in this ancient Near East worldview is he's just they're pawns in their game. Humans are to be used and abused by the gods. And the way that creation comes about, if you read the Babylonian story, I highly suggest if your kids are into any of that kind of mythology, read all of the creation accounts from the time of the Bible. It might scare you a little bit because there are some stories that sound very similar. The Babylonian account sounds very similar in terms of just the key plot points. The Egyptian account is maybe a little spicy. So maybe think about what words you want to use in place of certain things. It's a good practice as a parent. How can I clean this one up? But all of their stories kind of reveal the gods are like power hungry, they are greedy, they are like humans are at best like accidents, like they just happen to be created. At worst, they're literally created to be the slaves to the god, and like you will do our bidding. And why I say all of that is important is because when you understand that's the worldview that God's people are reading Genesis and hearing the story of creation surrounded by.
Through that lens. Yeah, it is so important. Is I think too, from where we sit in our modern context, we don't. Maybe we romanticize like what other people were believing or getting involved with. But yeah, I think this context is so super important to set us up.
Well, or even like if you have non-Christian friends, they probably look at creation and they think it's just as beautiful and good as we do, right? Like you don't have to be a follower of Jesus to desire to go to the mountains and look out at the beauty and the vast array of just like the plethora of God's creation. Like it's just gorgeous. Yeah. But that's such a modern idea. And even more so, like one step further, the idea that you would see human beings as valuable. That is like, whoa, like we are in a world away from the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Egyptians of the ancient Near East world. Because when you talk about being an image bearer, in their worldview, the only person that gets to call themselves made in the image of God is the Pharaoh, is the king. And so already from the get-go, the audacity of page 1 of scripture to call every human being, not just the kings, not just the men either, every human being is a king, a queen. Like
heirs.
C.S. Lewis is picking up on that. Like once a king or queen of Narnia, always a king or queen of Narnia. But like this notion that you have value just because you were created by God. I sometimes wonder, I think sometimes the church fights against when the world agrees with God. Like, like they're like, wait, you can't, we're special. And it's like, no. God is delighting in the fact that we do, at least in my corner of the world. I know that's not always true in every culture, in every community, even subcultures within our communities. But in general, the idea that we see human beings as valuable, I think God is so glad that we have that cultural perspective, because that's not what the people of Israel were hearing. And so already from the get-go, if you have that background, I think it'll change for you just as a person, not even just as a parent. Like, I hope that changes the way you read Genesis 1-3, because if you have that in the back of your head, you'll start to notice the words that are intentionally put in there. And you'll start to notice the character of our creator. You'll start to notice, what do the authors of Genesis want us to believe about not just God, but about ourselves, and maybe even more so about other human beings. And if you kind of do that, then I think it helps you talk in a really cool way with your kids, because that is something we want all of our kids to see. Like, we want everybody to recognize that human beings have value and that this creation is good and beautiful and we're a part of it and we get to have a place in it and a voice in it. And it's not just like accidental, like that's intentionally the purpose for us. Like, we are his partners in creation. And it doesn't diminish his godness. Like, it doesn't change his authority. There is something really cool about recognizing our God is not so power hungry that he doesn't want to share that.
Well, yeah, it's like when you're collaborating or passing something, it's sort of an extension of trust.
Yeah.
And the act of not really asking or needing us to steward something, but it's more of a, like, I'm engaging you in a way that I entrust this thing, and I value you, that you have the intelligence, the ability, or, you know, whatever, whoever you are, to take this thing and go with it.
I always like to ask my students, we always finish, I think I mentioned this the last time I was on the pod, but I always ask my students after we finish Genesis 1-3 to give me like your list of characteristics about God. And I'm always brought to tears. Like, it's just beautiful. Because one of them, I just was rereading them because I wanted to think about it before I talked to you. And one of my students wrote that God was generous. And their explanation for generosity was that he shares the creative process with us, and he shares responsibility with us. And her little excerpt at the bottom was about the first time she remembered her mom letting her stay home by herself, and how much like she was like, I could do anything with this power, but I knew like my mom was doing this and letting me be a part of it. And I followed up with her, and she was like, yeah, I totally did wrong things. Like I did what I wasn't supposed to do. And my mom knew it, but she was like, but she like corrected it and she let me do it again. Like, isn't that God? Like, how cool is that?
Well, and there's also a delighting too in the path that you may take with the given responsibility or collaboration or creativity. You know, it's just having that entrusted, and not sort of a demand, but like, this is such a cool thing. You get to watch or shepherd these things grow, you know, across the world. So I think that context is super helpful, because I think we often just assume like that is just a given in the way the which God should be operating towards us. But to have the context that the world doesn't, that's not really how the whole world was thinking about things.
Yeah. It's funny. I always talk with my students about that, like the context of what's happening in the world changes the way you write. And I use the example of, you know, Lord of the Flies as a touch point for all of my students, because they have to read it, I think, as a freshman. And I always ask, like, do you know when it was written? Like, oh, it was written in World War II. And I was like, oh, so World War II, maybe when there was boys on planes that were dropped on islands and they end up killing each other. Like, kind of sounds like there's a commentary here. And then I point out at the same time, not to keep referencing C.S. Lewis, it turns out I just
why not?
But when we started Chronicles of Narnia with my kids, we pointed out that same background
it's
of
the same time zone.
And yet the point of C.S. Lewis was trying to make was you are okay, and you are going to be okay, and there's somebody that's with you, and obviously there's all the beautiful subtext. But I feel like that's a similar way to think about if you have the perspective of a good God. That is like, I love your guys's like about us page of that God is with us, for us, and constantly redeeming us. Like, that is clearly at the heart of C.S. Lewis when he's writing this. And I don't know anything about William Golding. Like, maybe he is. Maybe he's just trying to communicate like the harshness of war, but it's a different perspective, right? Even though you have the same worldview, you're trying to communicate something different. And so I feel like, if just even trying to think about the parents and that are listening of any age kid, even their adult kids, is when you read it with that perspective, like, what do you see about God? Because I think it's so much harder to see God, in my mind, in those opening chapters as strict, judgmental, wrathful, like he's like unattainable. He doesn't want anything to do with us. Like, I've read all of those stories. I've read the Babylonian. I've read the God that is described like that. This is so polar.
So different. Yeah. It's poetry and creativity and beauty. Well, Sarah, it was so funny. This last weekend, we were riding home with my son, who's 16 almost. And it just popped in his brain, but he was like, why did God put the tree like in the midst of like Adam and Eve. He's like, I'm babysitting right now, and I wouldn't leave a knife in the room and just say, hey kids, don't touch that.
Yeah.
And so I think in those first 3 chapters, it's kind of like, this is kind of a setup for a redemptive narrative and thread that is to come. What do you think about like the tree in light of the setup for redemption?
Oh, I get that question all the time because your son is my like, these are my people. This is my wheelhouse.
It's like, wait, what?
I do think, I mean, I could talk a lot about that story and just the wisdom that is in Genesis 3, but it is setting up for us, not just the like, I don't know, maybe it's always framed as like, this is the gotcha moment. And then like, don't worry, he's going to come in and fix it. Yeah. I see Genesis 3 as revealing something we all are aware of this notion of the second that God decided to be generous in his authority and let us be a part of it, he is opening up exactly what my student described. He is opening up the opportunity for you to use your power for your own end, right? Mm-hmm. But we also know that there is wisdom in following the one who is greater, who is true wisdom. And I think that story is really about, do you let God be the one that gives wisdom, or do you try to take it and seize it according to my own wisdom? And my own wisdom says, operate out of scarcity because you won't have enough. Operate out of greed because, you know, you don't want somebody else to take something from you. Operate out of like, if I'm not the one who's going to be in control, I'm going to get controlled, right? Yeah. And so that story, like I always say, if it bothers you, if like a tree in the middle bothers you, if a snake bothers you, if all that, just skip it. Go to chapter 4, because like, you know, my students always ask, like, why would God put a tree in the middle if he knew they were going to eat from it? And I always say, oh, well, let's just read the next story. And when you read Genesis 4, like the language that is in Genesis 3 is constantly repeated. So this notion of to see something, notice it's desirable and take it, that like just those verb choices and that imagery is repeated over and over and over again. You can go look. It's in the story of Cain and Abel. It's in the story of Abraham and Sarah. It's in the story of Sarah and Hagar. It's David and Bathsheba. It's like, I can keep going, right? It's just constantly this seeing, notice something's desirable and take it. Well, in the story of Cain and Abel, the thing Cain sees that Abel is, we use the word favor, but it literally is God looks at Abel's offering and doesn't look at Cain's. But it doesn't even say like, and he was never going to look at Cain's. Like it is so vague. The story of Cain and Abel is so vague. There's so many like, who is Cain mad at? Is he mad at God? Is he mad at Abel? Is he mad at himself? Like why, why does he kill? It actually doesn't say, but it does say God tells Cain he says, sin is crouching at your door, ready to devour you, and you must rule over it. And that ruling image of God, nature, then gets brought up as Cain looks at Abel, and the thing he decides is best. God's wisdom is literally bare minimum, don't kill each other, right? Like we as parents know that, right? Like, but like bare minimum, God's wisdom, don't kill each other. And Cain says, yeah, but it would go better for me if he
didn't exist.
Yeah. And then Cain's response when God says, like, where's Abel? Am I my brother's keeper? Well, if you read page 1, you know the answer. We're made in the image of God. I am my brother. I'm the ruler. I care for creation. And so my response to your son would be, oh, why did God create Abel if he knew that Cain was going to kill him? Like, I don't like that question. Like, but it's the same story. And honestly, the rest of the time in scripture that we see Genesis 3 play out in terms of the language and the imagery, it's always human beings. And it's why I think it's a beautiful picture in Genesis 3 of this tree. But people are trees, man. Like there's always a choice in front of you. I never even
thought about that.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, I know I sound like a hippie from California, don't I?
Oh, I love it.
Trees, man. People are trees.
Well, yeah, but and Sarah, what do you think? Like, those first 3 chapters, like, is this the setup for layers and layers of redemption to the second Adam? Is this the, is this what we're kind of, for grownups listening, like, what are we beginning to, like, set us up for looking for as we read the text going forward?
Yeah. I love, part of it's because I'm an English person and I like books. But there's all these, we refer to them in our classroom as like these biblical themes of God is setting up in these opening chapters the way that he interacts with humanity. And the cool thing is every one of the biblical themes is really like a gospel metaphor of what does it mean that God brings light to the darkness? What does it mean that God brings order to the chaos? And you start to see, like, those are just a couple of them. But when you see the different, like, visuals that are on display in Genesis 1-3, there's just all these amazing pictures of the way that God works. And then clearly the authors of scripture are like tuned into that, because then they'll use that same language, they'll use those same pictures, but in another setting. And then, Jesus pops on the scene and he knows the Bible pretty well. And so when he speaks, sometimes he only has to say 1 or 2 words that if you've been tracking with the story, you're like, man, he is bringing me back to the garden, and he is showing me how he is the one that restores us back to that. And the ultimate hope of, like, that is going to happen in our own communities now. And as life begets life into eternity. Right. And so I even say, I remember when it first cracked for me that, like, page 1 of the Bible, I think, is a summary of the entire Bible. I think it is. So a dumb translation thing. So parents, if you're listening, just a stupid thing that we did as, I'm gonna guess it was in the English translation, but I'm not quite sure. But we added, all of the, like, chapter notes and verse notes that aren't there in the original scrolls. And so we decided to end chapter 1 of Genesis before the story of creation is done. It is the dumbest thing. So Genesis 1 verse 1 through Genesis 2 verse 3 is actually the first chapter of the Bible. That's the first page. But it is this cool story about, like, first of all, like, the first verse is 7 words, and the middle word is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the Aleph and the Tav. And so you're like, from the get-go, if you're meditating on it, you're like, wait a second, like, the beginning, middle, and end, like, what does this mean? And then you realize, like, the second verse is 14 words. And then starting in the third verse, we get the 7 days of creation, and they follow the same pattern, and there's certain words that are used 7 times or 10 times, and it's all on purpose. It's like beautiful writing, just the most magnificent poetry. The last poem on the 7th day of creation, it's 3 lines of 7. Like, it's just like, but I remember the first time realizing, it was a student that pointed it out, that the pattern of creation in the first account is God said, let there be, yada, yada, yada. It was good. There was evening and there was morning the first day. God said, let there be. And I asked the question of, what do you notice about the days of creation, and what breaks the pattern on the 7th day? And in my mind as a teacher, I was like, I know where they're going to go with this. Like, they've gone with this every other time of, like, they're going to point out the pattern. They're going to point out that day 7 doesn't have the pattern, and, like, he rests and all that. And a student said, wait, the 7th day doesn't end. Ooh. And I was like, wait, what? And they're like, well, it doesn't say there was evening and there was morning. And you said that's, like, the way to denote, like the end of the day. And I was like, wait, say that again. They're like, well, the 7th day doesn't end. Isn't that, like, the, like, hope? And I love I love high school students because they said it and they like were so confident at the beginning of their sentence. And then when they saw my face just like flabbergasted at something new, they added a question mark at the end. Like,
am I correct?
Isn't that the hope? And it really, I went on just like a 15-minute, like, guys, this is awesome. And we talked about what does that mean? Like, there's a seventh day that doesn't end. And then you read the gospel narratives and you're like, wait a second. There's darkness when Jesus dies. And then what does every gospel author make a point to say about the resurrection story? It always says on the first day of the week, either before the light had broken or at dawn or whatever it was. And you're like, or while it was still dark. And you're like, wait a second. Then Jesus busts out of that tomb and you're like, oh, we're going to have a seventh day that doesn't end. Like Jesus has ushered in the like promise of day one. Like it's so cool. Like I've
never heard this. So grown-ups out there, we had this question, like, what does 1 through 3 have to do with redemption? And there you go. Numbers say day 7.
And then you go to like, what's the point that's happening in day 3 in relation to that? And you're like, man, light is associated with order and everything about creation is this beautiful order and everything's coming out of chaos. And we kind of tend to screw this up a little bit. We latch onto things in the church and then we have a hard time undoing it. But
yeah,
we get really fixated on the phrase
curriculum. It's really
I know. But like we get really fixated on the phrase that God created ex nihilo. And I think sometimes then that like gets us into these weird conversations about what creation story is doing or not doing. I'm fine if you want to say that, as long as you're willing to admit that in the mind of the ancient Near East world, nothingness is water. Like if you think of nothingness as a vacuum, that's such a modern idea. Like nobody, like I always like the Stranger Things image of like 11 is in this like black void. I'm like, that's such a modern idea. Like, but nothingness in the ancient Near East world was water. Amazing. And every other creation account, the only thing that's eternal is the water, like the primordial waters. And like most of the time the gods come up out of the waters. And so even the notion of in the beginning, God is establishing his eternal nature. And then it says that he was hovering over the waters is a sign of his dominion over even this chaos. He doesn't come out of it. He has power
that's
over
such a
it.
good fact, everybody.
Yeah. And so then like even this notion of like there is darkness and he creates light and calls that good, and it has order over the darkness, and he has each one of these kind of parts in creation is establishing this peace that comes from the order God brings. And so when you look at Genesis 3 through that lens, you're like, man, our own like desire to have control, we just invite chaos.
Yeah.
And we invite darkness. And the story of the Bible is God saying, I will never let the darkness win. Like, I am going to bring the light over and over and over again. And yes, Jesus is that light embodied, but don't read the story of the Old Testament without seeing that God is this presence and light to those people. Isaiah would say he's the light in the darkness, right? It is dawned. And he's constantly bringing order when they've brought chaos. And you get to stories, I know we're not talking about Exodus, but you get to stories like Exodus and you're like,
come on back, Sarah. We have an Exodus zine.
All right. Yeah. But even to me, Exodus 1 through, I guess, 11 is really just it's like the Genesis story all over again of we're just seeing a big giant serpent called Pharaoh bringing chaos and darkness and death and exile. And God says, no, I am the one that redeems. I am the one that brings light to that darkness. And so the promise,
the covering for Adam and Eve are covered, and then the people are covered. There's just this I mean, that's
Well,
that's the fun thing when you get into the text and you have sort of like a few rhythms to keep your eye out for, grown-ups,
yeah,
and
yeah.
be curious about. It doesn't have to be so complex. If
No.
you sort of hold on to these few patterns that you see,
Yeah.
especially in those first 3 books of Genesis, and then you kind of carry that logic
Yeah.
throughout the text, then you're discovering new things that
A
reaffirm.
really easy one actually is water. So
I love that. I had no, I mean,
yeah.
I just,
So there's, in Hebrew, there's like tahom is the word that's for like the abyss. That's like chaos waters. And then there's mayim, which is like neutral water. That's like water that's in a well. But you can see like the story in Genesis 1 is really acknowledging there's like this chaos waters, and he, gathers those together and he forms land and he protects his people from it. And then Genesis 2, it's interesting. It's talking about Genesis, or it's talking about creation again, but now it describes it as there being like a desert wasteland, and that the garden is like on a mountain in the midst of this wasteland. And to our minds, that seems very opposite. Like, wait, is it in the middle of water or is it in the middle of desert? But in the ancient Near East mind, there is no difference between a desert and like the vast ocean, because what is the ocean but a watery wasteland? It's a water desert. You're going to die because you're either going to have, you're going to be abandoned in it, or something going to eat you. The Kraken going to get you. But so this notion of God creates life in the midst of that desert. In the Genesis 2 story, then, this is like just letting people pay attention to it. It says that in Genesis 2, the description in the garden, it says God planted a garden in Eden, and then it says, and out of it sprung a river and divided and became 4 rivers. And I remember reading that and being like, wait a second. I thought the garden, like a river, flowed through Eden, not out of Eden. And it was just that simple thing, and not like judging kids' books, but for me, it was, I always will go back to, we had these little like children's bulletins when I was a kid that like matched with like the adults had a bulletin for like what was going to happen at church. And then we had a little kids one that had like games in it, but usually the front picture was whatever was going to get talked about. And I still have in my head this picture of Adam and Eve standing beside a river in like a meadow, and there was mountains on the other side of it. And so in my mind, like, that's just how I've always read it, is with that picture in mind.
Like, well, what do the animals drink?
Yeah. So then it was reading that, like, wait a second, it's on a mountain. If it says that a river flows out, it's on a mountain because that's where headwaters start, right? And then it flows out. And then the question becomes, well, where does it go? And there's this paragraph that feels so out of place. Like, it just feels like it interrupts the poetry, because all of a sudden it's like, there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon, and it flowed around the whole land of Havilah. And there's gold there. And it goes through each of the places. But I'll just talk about 3 of the places because they're easy. It flows to Cush, which is associated with Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. And if you know the rest of the story, or you read the rest of the story, you realize those 3 places are associated with Israel's enemies. Those are the places where they are enslaved, oppressed, annihilated. Those are the last places that Israel wants to be. And I read Genesis 2, so you talk about this is a redemption story. I read that story of the garden even before Genesis 3, and I see this beautiful invitation of what the gospel does. Because it says that the river flows out of Eden, where God's people are at. And that there's no gates. There is this river that is flowing, and the places that it flows to are the wilderness, the desert. And it's the place of your enemies. And we know wherever the river flows, everything lives. That's Ezekiel 47. And so if it's going to go to Egypt, to Assyria, to Babylon, he's going to bring life. And that, to me, is one of the most beautiful setups for what God's story is. That we're going to see Abraham is given a promise that through you, all nations will be blessed. That we screw it up and we say that the Abrahamic covenant is for Israel. It's not. It's for all people through Israel. He says, you're going to be the river that goes. And so you see him go to Egypt. Obviously, the story of Genesis ends with them going to Egypt. He brings life through people like Daniel when they're in Babylon, right? Like we get to see these life-giving times where God actually brings the river to the places of exile and then draws them back in. And like for me, what is the gospel if not that like Jesus would be the river of life that would come to me in exile, and not just me, my enemies, the people I don't want to be saved, Jonah, right? Like I don't think are worthy of this, and he's like, yeah, I'm coming for you too. So no wonder he says to Nicodemus, like, if you're born of water and the Spirit, like jump in the river, man, we're going to eat it.
Well, Sarah, that is so profound. I think, we'll end with this note. I mean, this beautiful image of, I've never heard that before. I wish I could join your class and come back for Exodus for sure. But just, that we have a God that is constantly in motion towards our enemies, or who we perceive to be our enemies, and those who will oppress us. And God is interested in setting them free. And what a beautiful picture that is. And I've never even heard that before. Thank you, Sarah. And StoryMakers, just take in that image and think of also the places where we think God would never show up. He, from the very beginning, set everything in motion to redeem all people and all creation. So
amen.
Sarah, you're the best.
Oh, thanks, Mel.
And we can't wait to have you and dig in. Let's dig into Exodus.
Let's do it. I'll come back.
Bye.
Bye.